On the campaign trail, Mexico was very much in Donald Trump's crosshairs. Now that he's set to return to office, his pledges, including mass deportation of undocumented immigrants, a 25% tariff on Mexican goods and services, and a war on drug cartels, could indeed become a reality. What could these policies look like in practice, and how will they shape the future of U.S. Mexico relations? How might Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's president, respond to this more hawkish ideological shift in U.S. politics? Here to explore what lies ahead is Christopher Landau, who served as U.S. ambassador to Mexico from 2019 to 2021, bridging the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, and overseeing the ratification and entry into force of the USMCA, the current North American Free Trade Agreement. I'm Tony Payan, director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Mexico Centered. Welcome, Ambassador. Happy to have you here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, it's good to have you at the Institute. I remember we had to cancel your visit back in March 2020.
I'm still scarred by that. I think somewhere in my files, I still have the speech that I had written to deliver then. So hopefully this podcast can make up in some way for that missing speech. Well, let me just say at the outset, I'm here obviously as a private citizen right now. I mean, we're in December in the transition period. I'm not affiliated with the Trump campaign or the Trump transition. So I'm speaking as a private citizen.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us, and glad to have you here at the Baker Institute. So Mr. Trump is coming back into office. You obviously have a relationship with him. You were his ambassador to Mexico for several years. And not only that, but you got to see all the different things that were going on in Mexico under the López Obrador administration. And of course, you oversaw the transition from NAFTA to the USMCA. So it must have been a very interesting time. The issues are going to be the same. One of them is, of course, immigration. Tell us a little bit about immigration when you were ambassador, how you dealt with it, and what we can expect under the new Trump administration, especially because he has made some promises on the issue of immigration. And how is that going to affect, in your view, the binational relationship?
Sure. On immigration, I think the first thing that I always like to point out is that the immigration issue we face today between the U.S. and Mexico, our common border, is very different than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. It's a relatively recent demographic development. As you know, and I'm sure your listeners are aware, historically, Mexican nationals were the overwhelming majority, 90+%, or probably 99% of the people crossing the U.S. Mexico border were Mexican nationals. So the border was really a binational U.S. Mexico issue. That started to change about 10 years ago. We saw some of the first unaccompanied minors from Central America and other places come up. And I think that posed challenges. It's one of the reasons that the border was an issue in 2016 when President Trump ran and won the first time. And it posed practical challenges because our immigration system was built, in a sense, to deal with the reality that it had long confronted, which was adult male Mexicans crossing the border, particularly during Mexico's big demographic boom in the 90s and 2000s, was somewhat of a safety valve for Mexico, and there was a mass migration. But the migration we face nowadays, I think, creates challenges insofar as our system really isn't set up to create expedited removal and some of the other legal mechanisms that have traditionally been used to deal with the crisis when it was Mexicans. But at the same time, I think probably the most relevant answer to your question is, I think the current situation where Mexicans are now the minority of people crossing the border. The statistics I've seen are anywhere from about a quarter to a third of the people, it obviously varies day to day, that are encountered by CBP at the border are Mexican nationals. And so I think that opens the door for Mexico and the United States to cooperate on the migration issue, because the truth is Mexico doesn't have any interest in being a doormat for millions of people from all over the world who want to try to enter the United States. So I think actually the field is ripe to cooperate with Mexico. And some of the initial signals I've seen from the Sheinbaum government have been very promising in terms of their willingness to cooperate, just as President Trump cooperated with President López Obrador, which a lot of people did not expect. In a sense, going to your broader question about President Trump, we've already seen a Trump administration and Mexico, and a lot of people predicted all kinds of catastrophe. I think we saw that in practice, it actually worked out well. I mean, we found common grounds. It was a challenging assignment. I was the ambassador there for 2 years of that, and we kind of condensed 10 years of history, I feel, into 2 years. But we actually were able to accomplish a lot. So I believe, again, that we can work with Mexico to address these challenges. And our relationship is so multifaceted. Immigration is a large part of it. I'm sure we'll talk about the other parts, but everything is connected. And I think if we want our relationship to be healthy in one area, it's got to be healthy in the others. The one thing I'll say is traditionally there's been an attempt to disaggregate immigration issues from commercial issues, which I don't really think works as a practical reality. And certainly that's not the way President Trump looks at the world. And if the kitchen is on fire, you got to put out the fire. You can't talk about redecorating the living room until you've put out the fire in the kitchen.
Right. I think the numbers have shifted, and I think hopefully Mexico and the U.S. will find some common ground on this issue because it is an irritant, and I think it has the potential to be it again. A second issue that certainly was in President-elect Trump's mind, and this time I think more strongly so, is fentanyl and drug trafficking. And you were ambassador to Mexico. You know very well what's been going on in Mexico in terms of organized crime and the way it's going to gain some terrain and territory and the way they've expanded their activities, victimizing Mexican citizens, not just affecting millions of Americans, but also affecting millions of Mexicans as well. And President Trump has said very clear, this is something that is going to be at the forefront of the binational relationship. We're going to deal with it. And if Mexico doesn't cooperate, it may be done unilaterally. Who knows what that means? What did you see in the past during your term? What do you see today? And what do you think our listeners should expect in the coming years?
I think this is a major challenge that requires a lot of creative thinking and commitment from both sides. For many, many years, decades, we've been locked in this paradigm where Mexico says, well, this is all your fault because you guys consume the drugs and you send us the arms and the money. And we say, you guys send us the drugs, you've got to crack down on the crime. And as ambassador, I was so frustrated by this because, of course, both sides are correct. And I feel both sides try to make excuses for their failure to make progress on their side of the border on matters that are within their own jurisdiction, that instead of actually doing what they can do, they prefer to just point the finger at the other country. And as ambassador, I was very upfront about saying, I am happy to talk about guns, happy to talk about consumption issues. I mean, I agree, those are legitimate subjects. But certainly from Mexico's point of view, I don't think you can just say that and do nothing. That doesn't seem to be an answer. And again, I think it's not an answer for Mexico to bear the whole brunt of the fight against drug cartels. I mean, it's a shared problem, and I think it's going to require a shared solution. Again, this problem, like the migration problem, has changed markedly in the past decade or so with the rise of synthetic opioids. I mean, this has been an intractable problem, again, for decades, but a very different problem. We were talking about organic substances like cocaine coming up from South America through Mexico, or heroin, created from the poppies in Guerrero and up in Durango and that area as well, in the Sierra. But now you used to have farmers cultivating acres of crops, which were an open site, and we still weren't able to eradicate that successfully. Now you get the precursor chemicals for fentanyl. You can be in your lab in a basement in Culiacan or in Mexico City or in Guadalajara, and you can create enough of these substances, these synthetic opioids, to basically kill a person with the equivalent of 1 grain of salt or of sand. So 1 brick of these substances is enough to kill an entire town, let's say. And so it makes the challenge much more daunting. I think it is a problem, obviously, for Mexico that organized crime is very powerful in Mexico. The United States is Mexico's neighbor. It's concern to the United States. I also think we have recognized from our experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq that we have to look at these problems with a sense of humility, right? We can't just wave a magic wand and the problem is solved. We can't be the world's policeman. Mexico has had a lot of these challenges of domestic security going back to the vice-regal days or even before, right? I mean, it's never had a truly effective system of civilian law enforcement throughout the country. That there's been problems throughout its history. So the United States cannot come in and solve Mexico's domestic criminal problems. But again, I think Mexico is going to have to show the United States that it is doing some things. For me, Tony, we should try to identify what's some of the most low-hanging fruit on the tree, right? I think one of the obvious things, to my point of view, is the shipments coming in from China. What about port security in Mazatlan or in Manzanillo or Lázaro Cárdenas, all these great ports on the Pacific where these things are coming in? I realize it's not easy, but there are certainly protocols and methods to try to do this. While I was ambassador, the President López Obrador took the aduanas out of there and put the military in. I haven't really been seeing how that has actually operated. But, there's obviously a lot of corruption in Mexico. So I don't think President Trump is going to sit by and just say, this is fine, we can live with this. By the same token, I think Mexico has to be clear in terms of what we can do as the United States. Let me give you one example. Everybody likes to talk about the guns. The entire time I was ambassador, the entire time for almost 2 years, I went to Mexican government officials. I said, we are willing to donate to you some non-intrusive arches that will search for the guns at the border, right? And they will do an x-ray, basically. They never accepted them. And they were giving me excuses. And I talked to the head of every division. And, I think they were concerned because this could be considered to be Iniciativa Mérida. And that was considered to be militarized in the Calderón strategy. And I said, guys, I can't take you seriously as somebody who really cares about the weapons if we're offering to give you these non-intrusive articles and you're not accepting them.
President Sheinbaum has said that the drug consumption problem is an American problem. The reality is that there's a lot of drug consumption in Mexico too, but there are no studies because I think the money to look at drug addiction in Mexico has dried up. So it may be more of a joint problem than we think.
It could be. Look, Mexico has certain family structures and the economic realities have, for whatever reason, I think traditionally there's been less drug consumption in Mexico writ large. But my impression is that, there are pockets of Mexico where you're starting to see addiction problems. And again, we have to break out of this attitude of, no, it's your fault, okay? This is your consumption. Or where we just say to Mexico, it's all your fault. I mean, we're never going to solve the problem if we spend more energy critiquing each other than fighting the drug cartels.
One other thing that I think is going to be very much at the forefront of the following administration is trade. You shepherded the USMCA, obviously, as you were ambassador to Mexico. You saw the negotiations between, 2017 through 2019, and then enter into force, I think, on July 1st, 2020. The agreement mandates a review and revision by July 26. 270 days before, by October 1st of this coming year, 2025, Congress must be notified. So it's coming up. It's less than a year now. I don't expect the Trump administration to simply review and say, check, check, check. It may not be working. It's working. Don't move it. Move on. I think he's already promised revisions. What do you expect to see there? What are some of the major issues that are coming up in the review and revision of the agreement? We're engaging a project at the Baker Institute looking ahead at some of those issues. It's going to be thorny. It's going to be difficult, but it has to be done. What do you see?
I agree with you. I think it's going to be a complicated process. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think you can look at any of these issues in isolation. And I think the extent to which the Trump administration, I'm just predicting, I'm not a member of that administration as I sit here today, will, depending on the level of cooperation from Mexico on issues like migration and security, I think that will obviously influence the willingness of the Trump administration to cut a deal with Mexico. This is one of the major differences between the old NAFTA free trade structure from the early 90s and the new USMCA or TEMEC, is that TEMEC has this sunset period or this review period, which comes up, which I think is actually a healthy thing because not every document obviously can foresee the rapid technological changes and all the other world changes. For instance, I think one enormous challenge that both countries face is Chinese penetration of the North American market. I've been saying this now for years. If there's the reality or the perception that Mexico is using the USMCA as a springboard for Chinese goods to evade the direct tariffs that are being placed on China, if they can avoid the 25% tariff on products from China by shipping to Mexico or manufacturing in Mexico and then sending Chinese goods into the United States from Mexico, that's going to be a big problem. again, the Chinese are very resourceful at coming up with holes. When you create a system, the Chinese are immediately poking for the holes in the system. And I think there are some holes in this, specifically with respect to China. I mean, to me, the biggest issue that we've got to confront is Chinese electric vehicles. The plans are very substantial. I have actually seen, I believe, some news reports just in the last few weeks since the election that maybe those plans are already being scaled back because the Chinese, I think, recognize that this gambit will not work to try to penetrate the North American market. But I think those problems are solvable. That is not a Mexico-specific issue for President Trump. I think at a global level, one of his major foreign policy concerns is the concern that the U.S. has been the subject of unfair trade agreements where other countries, including Europe, the Far East, I mean, it's not just a Mexico issue, have unfairly taken advantage of the United States. And certainly we have some issues here about the hollowing out of our manufacturing sector. Again, I think there are going to be some tough negotiations, but ultimately I am optimistic that there are going to be win-win solutions and that both countries will recognize that having an agreement and the increased trade that has been generated is ultimately better than not having an agreement. But who knows? Time will tell.
I'm glad you're talking to foreign policy because clearly it looks like Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is going to be the Secretary of State. I don't think he'll have any problems being confirmed, and he's made it very clear that he's going to create an alliance of friendly governments in Latin America. I think he's talking perhaps Argentina, El Salvador, and such. But we've seen Mexico's foreign policy drift away bit by bit towards an alliance with some questionable regimes, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and defend them and send oil to them. He's already spoken to the issue of Mexico's oil subsidies, gasoline subsidies to Cuba, and things like that. A new surprise may come to Mexico from the State Department. Rubio is obviously a Hispanic American, a Cuban American. He's got a very personal history with Latin America. He certainly believes certain things. What do you see there? I mean, it may get a little rocky for the foreign ministry in Mexico and the State Department under Marco Rubio.
It could. I mean, the flip side of that is that I think he will be the Secretary of State most interested and engaged in Latin American affairs probably in our lifetimes. And so I think that itself is a very valuable commodity in a sense for the region, which I am a strong believer has been put in the back seat for far too long. Again, one of the reasons I wanted the job in Mexico was precisely because I am convinced that our own national security and prosperity here in the United States depends critically on the relationship with Mexico in particular, but with the region in general. And I think we have not done enough over the years to keep up the focus to have anything that even could be coherently called a policy towards Latin America. We've just been drifting on autopilot for many, many years across administrations of both political parties. And I think it is time to re-engage with the hemisphere. It worries me a little bit, or worries is probably the wrong word, but as you know, and your listeners I'm sure will know, I mean, Mexico in my lifetime, certainly in the 70s, was very much into the tercermundismo. This is in the López Portillo and Echeverría administrations. Mexico always kind of made a point of being chummy with some of the leftist regimes, with Cuba, and that was kind of the centerpiece of Mexican foreign policy, I think, was kind of to always be on good terms with the United States, but always to poke the United States too, to show a certain amount of distance. I actually thought that during the López Obrador administration, this kind of traditional attitude of the PRI of the 70s and 80s was mercifully gone. I mean, one of the things about both López Obrador and Trump is that both of them, I think, are somewhat free of the orthodoxies of their own parties and would often say and do things in a kind of a new way. And López Obrador, I thought, was remarkably aligned with the United States in his policies. He was not looking to create waves in the relationship with the United States. And I mean, his first trip was to Washington, his first international trip as president, to see President Trump. And, I think he was not looking to be a regional leader to stand up to the United States. I think he was very focused on Mexican domestic politics. I'm a little bit concerned about some of the things we've been seeing lately in Mexico, if it will kind of go back to that model, which I don't think is healthy for both countries. I'm not sure how much runway Mexico has to pursue those kind of foreign policies now that it's so much more dependent on the United States. I mean, those policies were remnants of the distant neighbors period, right? I don't see how you can be the main commercial partner of the United States trying to renegotiate the trade agreement and then sticking it to us on, Cuba, Venezuela, whatever. I think that's going to be a very delicate dance for Mexico.
Yeah, just a couple more things. One, I'm a firm believer in a North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico working in tandem to create a prosperous, strong, democratic region. I don't feel that Washington and Mexico are on the same page these days. I think Ottawa is a little bit concerned. We had a conversation, a workshop this afternoon on this issue. It looks like on China, for example, Canada is certainly aligning its interests with those of the United States. Mexico is still kind of hesitant. You brought that up a little bit ago. Is North America something that we should aspire to? What are the obstacles to do that? How can we get North America going again?
I may have slightly different premises to start out with. I mean, I'm a strong nationalist for the United States. I mean, I still believe that the basis of the international order is different sovereign states advocating for their own sovereign interests and, obviously cooperating with other sovereigns when it's in their own self-interest. I think there are reasons as North America that we can be stronger together. But I personally think it's somewhat fanciful to think of North America as a region akin to Europe, let's say, just given the dramatic economic, cultural differences. And, the Mexican government is a nationalist government too. I mean, López Obrador is a nationalist. I think for that reason, we're able to kind of understand each other during the Trump administration, because I think, frankly, the biggest divide of our time on the international scene is not between different nationalists. It's between nationalism itself and globalism. And I think I consider myself, and certainly President Trump, is on the nationalist side of that. So, certainly that is where the U.S. foreign policy will be for the next 4 years. I don't think that has to be hostile to Mexico or North American cooperation. I think it just understands that in a slightly different framework than somebody who just comes at it from the starting point from a more regional perspective.
If asked, would you go back to Mexico?
I love that job, and I don't feel like I finished that job. So we shall see.
Tell me, to end, your favorite story of your ambassadorship in Mexico. Something that you remember that you say, wow, that was an interesting detail, moment, exchange, experience.
One thing that really moves me, and I just was reminded of this the other day, given the calendar, was that for Day of the Dead, my first year there in 2019, we went to the Zona Lacustre de Pátzcuaro in Michoacán. And that's such a wonderful, authentic part of Mexico. I mean, Mexico has many parts like this, but Michoacán is very special to me and to my family because we remember this trip so vividly. And the mayor of Pátzcuaro had, in the city hall there, made an incredible altar to my father that my father had just died that year. It was the first anniversary of his death. And it was the cempasúchiles that filled the hall and a big photograph of my father. I will remember that image till the day I die. I mean, it was such a lovely image. I find that whole Day of the Dead celebration very meaningful and moving. And the fact that somebody had taken the trouble to do one for my father was just a moment that I will take with me to my grave.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for joining us today. I'm very appreciative of your visit to the Baker Institute.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Leigh Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the center, and to Lisa Wakita, our program manager. This episode was produced by Lisa Wakita and Karina Zimmel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico to learn more. Thanks for listening.